I'm doing my Robbie Cole impression. Anyway, hi Yu-Gi-Oh players, I'm your host, the RJB0. Welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! And Business Casual. So, on Wednesday, I was at my local Battle City tournament event, and I was discussing with a friend afterwards some of our matchups. And I mentioned that one of my opponents had been particularly salty to be beaten by Chainbeat. And he said, well, anybody would be salty to be beaten by Chainbeat. And I said, what are you talking about? Chainbeat is the least degenerate deck of the format. And his response was, yeah, maybe if the format was entirely made of Chainbeat. Now, this video is not to gripe about this guy or to defend the honor of Chainbeat. I don't think I have to do that. You guys have seen my duels. You know how it plays. But what that conversation revealed to me is that there is a very wide definition of degenerate in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! People tend to use the word degenerate kind of offhand. They use the term very loosely, generally just to describe any deck that or card that they don't happen to like. You'd be hard pressed to come up with any consensus on a definition for degenerate. So what I want to talk about today is a definition for degenerate decks that I've developed, and kind of discussing what makes a deck degenerate in general. And this also extends to individual cards. So the definition that I have developed for degenerate decks in particular, degenerate cards, I have kind of a different definition, but I might get to that in another video, which is that a degenerate deck is any deck whose goal and win condition is entirely based around making your opponent not play the game, keeping from playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, there is the argument out there right now that a lot of the main strategies in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now are keeping the opponent from playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! But there's a difference between creating a strategy which stops the opponent from playing for a turn or until they get an answer, and making a deck entirely geared toward making sure player interaction doesn't happen. So this extends to decks that stall, decks that create absolute lockdowns, or try to maintain absolute lockdowns, and decks whose purpose is to stall out until they get an OTK and win during one turn with minimal player interaction. So as any scientific term does, the evolution of the definition of degenerate also evolves the list of things that fit under the term degenerate. And so with this change of definition, a lot of decks that people generally consider to be degenerate don't necessarily match this description. I might get a lot of hate for this list because a lot of people have very strong opinions about certain decks one way or another, but when you talk about degenerate decks based on the definition that I have just given, objectively there are a few changes you have to make. The first one, and probably one of the least popular, is that Dark Worlds, under this definition, does not count as a degenerate deck. Yes, it's incredibly obnoxious, but it isn't necessarily degenerate to the game. The existence of Dark Worlds and the playing of Dark Worlds doesn't necessarily hurt gameplay. A lot of people will argue that they do have strategies that stop you from playing the game. Things like drag down and skill drain. Well, drag down is arguable. While it does do the confiscation thing of choosing a card out of your opponent's hand that you don't want your opponent to have, which is broken, don't get me wrong, but that isn't necessarily degenerate. It doesn't keep your opponent from playing the game. It takes out one card from their hand, which if your deck is destroyed by having one card taken out of your hand and then replaced with another one, so it isn't just a -1 in the end for you. If you think that that is a problem for your deck, then your deck is probably bad anyway. But drag down into the grave in and of itself is not necessarily a degenerate card. And yes, they do sometimes run skill drain, and oftentimes they side deck it, but let me tell you, you probably side deck a lot of cards that are built to have a lockdown on your opponent. If you're not playing Fire Fist or Bujin or something like that, you're probably siding DNA Surgery in order to stop your opponent from making their moves. Or maybe you are playing Fire Fist and you're playing D-Fissure. Or Bujins and you're playing Kaiser Coliseum. So no matter what deck you're playing, you're probably siding in some cards that are meant to limit player interaction to stop your opponent from playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! So that in and of itself does not make a card or a deck degenerate. And the other thing that this definition opens up is the possibility that the mid 2012 Inzectors were not a degenerate deck, which a lot of people will disagree with me on. But if you think about it, the goal of Inzectors was not to stop your opponent from playing the game. Sometimes it was to like psych your opponent out of making their best plays, since they didn't want to commit too much to the field. But in the end, there was player interaction between the Inzector player and the player going against the Inzector player. The player going against the Inzector player can stop their strategies with things like Veiler, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, Skill Drain, and Fiendish Chain. These are all things that are pretty common to either the side deck or the main deck that actually create some degree of player interaction in order to stop them. And there is that possibility. Inzectors do not limit the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! From being played, and they didn't back then. They did win a lot, and they did define the format, and they were very strong, and they were everywhere, but I think people are too quick to label a deck that's really good as being degenerate. A deck that is really good is not necessarily degenerate, in the same way that a deck isn't necessarily exempt from being degenerate just because it isn't seeing a lot of play. Final Countdown was a degenerate deck, but it was not seeing a whole lot of play in top tournaments. Same goes for Empty Jar back when that was a thing. So, all in all, a lot of people are very quick to label a deck as degenerate just because it is defining a format. There have always been top-tier decks, and those top-tier decks have always eliminated a certain number of decks from the competition just by merit of the play style of the deck and how good it is. And the same goes for Inzectors, same goes for basically every deck in history. But what this definition does is it also brings in new decks to be considered as degenerate. One is Dino Rabbit to a degree. It's got an aspect of degenerateness to it, but it doesn't create a heavy lockdown. There is still that player interaction that you have to go through in order to play a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Between two Dino Rabbit decks. But it does include Evil Swarms. Evil Swarms, in their main strategy, such as it is so far as the game has seen, have been a relatively degenerate deck. Last format, the entire purpose of Evil Swarms was to put Ophion on the board and stop your opponent from playing cards. That was the main focus of the deck. You protected the Ophion so that your opponent couldn't play cards. And if you're playing against spellbooks, you would play the Ophion so that you could play Eradicator so that your opponent couldn't play cards. So Evil Swarms, by this definition, are a degenerate deck. And I've often actually kind of considered Evil Swarms to be a degenerate deck. I've always thought that they were just kind of, they eliminated the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! From the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And under this definition, that naturally makes a deck degenerate, but I always just didn't like them anyway for that reason. I don't think they're necessarily a good deck, but that doesn't, once again, stop them from being degenerate. Another deck that could possibly go onto the list of decks that are degenerate is Constellar. Constellar players will always argue with me on this, but I've talked to a number of my locals using this particular definition and asking them, truthfully, honestly, tell me, give me the feedback. If you're watching a Constellar player and their opponent is just making good moves every turn, their opponent is allowed to make moves, do you think that that's a good Constellar player? And their honest answer is always no. That Constellar player is obviously playing the deck wrong if their opponent is making moves. And by definition, that makes Constellars a degenerate deck. Degenerate cards are a little bit of a different deal. They're things that are insta-sacks, insta-wins, like if you get it, it basically destroys the game, it ends the game, it stops the game from being played. There are degenerate cards out there, but they aren't necessarily as important to discuss as degenerate decks. So that is my definition of degenerate decks, and the list that is created as a result of that definition, and I hope you guys like it. If you did like this video, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why in the comment section below, and discuss what is your definition of degenerate, what do you think of my definition, all sorts of things, and then of course, subscribe for more decks discussion, analysis, and general Yu-Gi-Oh! Shenanigans. Meanwhile, thank you guys for watching Yu-Gi-Oh! Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.